Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's session. We're going to just give a few more minutes for other people to join in, and then we'll make a start by 7:05. Okay, well, I think we'll make a start now. Probably some more people will join us as we go, but it's time to get going. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this latest session in our Talk Farm Regen discussion group. The idea for this session started when Caroline dropped a message in our Facebook discussion group talking about the project that the Floodplain Meadows Partnership is currently running in Wales. And from that, we had the idea of running a webinar and widening it a bit to cover species-rich grasslands more generally. So as well as Caroline O'Rourke and David Gowing from the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, we also have Joe Ryder, who is a local Monmouthshire farmer and also Conservation Grazing Manager at Gwent Wildlife Trust. Just before I hand over to our speakers, a little bit about our group, Talk Farm Regen Monmouthshire, which is a farmer-led discussion group focusing on regenerative and sustainable farming practices, in particular soil health and grassland management. Scott Miller, who can't be here tonight, is our leading light and does a huge amount of coordinating and organising of our events. The group is also facilitated and supported by Monmouthshire County Council, who I work for. And we're very grateful to our funders, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, for making it all possible for us. Word of warning just to say this session is being recorded, and the recording will of course be made available afterwards. We're going to have presentations first, and then there will be a Q&A discussion session at the end. If questions come to you as you're hearing the sessions, please just pop them in the Q&A, and then we'll work through those and read them out to our panelists after they finished speaking. So I hope you find it an interesting session tonight. We're aiming to finish at about 8 p.m. And without further ado, I shall hand over to Joe Ryder.
Good evening. How are you all doing? I'm Joe Ryder. I am the Conservation Grazing Officer for the Gwent Wildlife Trust, and I also have a small farm myself, and we have around about 90 acres of grassland. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is species-rich grassland and how they kind of fit into the farming system. So when we're thinking of species-rich grassland, we're generally thinking around hay meadows. Can everyone see the screen okay? Is that a yes or a no?
Not yet, Joe.
Is it not come on yet, is it? Let me escape out of that a minute. Zoom. Share screen. Wait a minute, sorry then. How about now?
No, it's still not coming through, I'm afraid.
Okay, let me go back to Zoom again. Oh, I see. I've highlighted it there. Share.
Brilliant. Yep, if you go into full screen, that'll be fine.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Yeah, I got it. Hooray! Sorry about that. Yeah, so here we go. we've got a nice picture there. This is Wisewood Common, so it's at the top of Penalt, and we are looking over the Wye Valley with the mist in the background. We've got, these are Gwent Wildlife Trust owned longhorns. We only have 9 cattle in total, and they are actually spaced out on around about almost 60 hectares on this site. We've got sheep on there and we've got ponies as well. So we're generally at a low stocking rate, and that is our main purpose is nature recovery on the reserves that we run. But boosting that nature recovery are the livestock on there, and mixed in with the livestock are the species rich grassland, which are a vital part of our reserves. So we'll move on to sort of management. So I've set this up so that we're sort of looking at it through the seasons, so to kind of get a logical sense of how we fit them in the farm system. So we're starting around about now. You may have noticed it's been quite wet recently, so, and very mild. So we've come on a little bit of a problem. You can see on the right hand of the screen there, we've already got some really early growth. Those rosettes you can see are actually cowslips, and so they're already sort of quite well emerged. So I'm generally keeping sort of a kind of a close eye on the early growth, and because we've had barely any frost or barely any cold weather up until this weekend just gone, we've got quite a lot of early growth, and so I've had to shut off these fields already. So we're talking already we've got about 35 hectares of species-rich grassland shut off at Pentwyn Farm and Wisewood Common, which are just outside of Monmouth. The other problem, as you can see on the left-hand side, it's been incredibly wet and we're getting more and more poaching. And again, I was concerned about sort of damage to the species-rich grassland. And so I've sort of played safe and moved them off onto our permanent pasture, which we use through the spring, summer and autumn. So ideally, I would have liked to have left them on there another sort of 3 weeks or more, really, but played safe and moved them off. So this is sort of seeming to be more of a problem, wet winters and mild winters. So on the right hand side of this slide, we can see a half-cut meadow. This is at my place. So what I've done here, these are very wet fields. I've left half of the meadow uncut in September time, and I was hoping then I could stock it and it'd hold up a lot better through the winter. I've still got my cut meadow, which we've sort of got about sort of 35-40 bales off on the other side. Unfortunately, the cattle seem to love spending most of their time on the regrowth and not much time on the rough grassland that's uncut. And then on the left-hand side here, we've got some cattle dung as well, which has been really important for the nature recovery as well. So that's constantly there through the winter, and that's attracting in sort of skylarks, meadow pipits, stone chats I had on there the other day as well. So it's a nice little selection, a nice little added in habitat that the cattle have brought with them. There's another picture here. They're actually on the left hand side. We've got about 5 cows, Herefords with 4 calves, and they're actually grazing on there now. So that's held up really well. It's unpoached, and that has worked really well because it's saved me keeping those cattle in the barn all winter. They're just outside where we are. It's incredibly wet. So that's worked nicely. How well that'll come back with the species-rich grassland following this spring and summer, I don't know, but I have tried it before 2 years ago, and it seemed to work quite well. On the right-hand side, this is January. We've got cattle here, and that's on a meadow, and it's nearly all cut. And because there's no extra kind of forage left there, I've been transporting out hay manually, and that's taken up a lot of my time. So it's, you know, I'm starting to favor this idea if it works as well with the species rich return in the summer, which I think it will, and I hope it will. Yeah, so shutting off again, for us to manage a species rich grassland, we shut off for a long time. So March right the way through to August, really. And then depending on the weather, again, we're always trying to cut hay, and so it can run into September. This year was an absolute nightmare. We were well into September. We missed that little hot bit in early September, and then we were into sort of wet, soggy end of September in the end. So that it was a difficult year. This is the year before, so they're kind of nicer pictures, and it was hot and dry for a while. So again, the feed value there can vary hugely. Here on the left-hand side, Lower Gocket, 10th of July, there's a really nice mix in there. There's a lot of bird's foot trefoil, there's red clover in there. We've got a lot of sweet vernel in there. We haven't got that much knapweed. You can see a little bit towards the back, and that makes some lovely sheep hay. Wisewood, this is a field in conversion. It's been in since around 2010. But it's still, you can see in that picture, there's an awful lot of ryegrass there. It's gone super dry. There's lots of docks. There's quite a lot of white clover, but because we cut late, that white clover's kind of pretty much dried up and disappeared. So it's not in the bales, unfortunately. Having said that, though, parts of it are making a nice return. And we have got bird's foot trefoil creeping in there. We've got yellow rattle in there, and we've also got a nice array of orchids sort of starting to spread out in there from Pentwyn Farm. So it's not going too bad. So yeah, we're going to be continuing on with that. This contraption here is our quad bike with our seed harvester. So before we cut our hay, we try and dash out with the quad bike and the seed harvester. And it's another little sort of business we've got at Gwent Wildlife Trust, because we can sell this to the local wildlife site owners and beyond. We actually ask for donations because technically we're not allowed to sell seed. So the machine is basically like a yard sweep, really. We drive around and round. It collects all this chaff in there. We shovel it out into builder bags, and then it's dried and sorted into kind of large paper sacks, and then we ask for a donation for that. And actually some years that can create more income than the hay itself. So it's been quite popular from gardens to sort of bigger local wildlife site owners trying to enrich meadows, and get more seed going in their fields. Just out of interest, this field that I've been using it in here, you can see, is a field that we don't actually cut. So species rich grasslands, again, not all of the ones at Pentwyn Farm are actually mown as meadows. So I'll shut them off at a similar time, and then we'll start grazing them in the sort of late June and early July with cattle. So that's another option going forward, because obviously not all sites are suitable for big tractors to go in, mowing, etc., etc. So yeah, I'm quite sort of into trialing things like that. So we've got Pentwyn Farm there. We're actually finally getting around to cutting. It's 26th of August 2022. In the foreground there, you can see a big area of bracken. That is something else that we're sort of trying to kind of control on the farm. It's slowly creeping in, and it's not great cutting it and mowing it into bales. So we bracken bash with cattle actually where we can, and then with like a cylindrical basher that goes behind a quad. But that's done through August. And then this is Wisewood. We're into September. We've done all the baling. We were in a Glaswelltir agreement, so we generally leave the follow-on grazing, the aftermath grazing, for about 4 to 6 weeks after. So even though that's cut and baled, we'd still leave it empty for another 4 to 6 weeks. So that's another sort of consideration of management in the farm, really. The next slide, and you can see here, this is the same shot where I'm still in the same place. The chap that's not collected his bales, they're still in the field, unfortunately. We've got some nice regrowth there, and we're about to put sheep on there. And I think he pretty much came the same day and collected up those hay bales, took them away. In the background there, you can see the piece that's not been cut. This field isn't in a glass-steer agreement, or wasn't, they've ended anyway now. And so we had the chance to sort of play around on leaving it not cut. And then through the winter, what we've done is using electric fences as grazing areas across there with the cattle and the sheep to some extent as well. And we were sort of hoping to add in other habitat layers rather than cutting it all at once. Now we've established and dropped nutrients there that we can utilize that better with the cattle in the winter, rather than having to transfer them back to the permanent pasture and saving that for the summer. So that's the kind of the theory behind that. To keep them on there, that's quite a sizable field. I think it's 9 hectares around. I'm using a combination of electric fencing, and that's one of the energizers. We've got solar energizers, a pretty good Gallagher reel system, and also a wrapper system, and that works well. Even with really large cattle, you know, we can really shut them down using that sort of mob style grazing if we so choose to. Generally, we're extensive, and we tend to shut pieces off to sort of provide additional habitat through the year. We've also been trialing the no fence collars. And to be honest with you, for us at the moment, we don't really have a great use for those. They're more suited, I think, for massive, extensive areas on tops of hills, you know, a couple of 100 acres you're trying to keep them in on. It doesn't seem to work so well on smaller meadows, and kind of, you've also got the bother of, you know, trying to take them off. If you've got well-trained cattle, you can walk up to in a field and take them off. That works. For us, we've got to then move them down to a big corral which isn't connected up, so that can take added time. So actually the e-fencing systems have come on leaps and bounds, and I really enjoy using these, and they seem to work really well for me, so I'm kind of a big fan of those. Yeah, so I think that's about it. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, really. I don't want to we've got time for questions after. So if anyone wants to ask me specific questions about how we're fitting this type of habitat into our farm system, I'm happy to answer questions, but that's kind of an overview. And I think my 10 minutes is about up, I think.
Thank you ever so much, Joe. That was
Okay.
really interesting. I know I've got a couple of questions, and I'm sure there will be others as well as we get to the Q&A session. If you could stop sharing your screen, please,
stop sharing,
and then we'll be able to hand over then to Caroline, and I think David is going to be there waiting in the wings. But Caroline, the stage is yours.
Okay, I am just going to share my screen for you. If you could let me know if that's visible.
Yeah, we can see that. Thank you, Caroline.
Okay, lovely. I'm just going to dive in then. So hi everyone, thanks very much for having us. We're really pleased to be here. I'm Caroline O'Rourke, and I'm a research associate at the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, and David Gowing, Professor David Gowing, is here too. He's going to try and answer some questions as we go along, so if you've got any, pop them in either the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try our best. So I'm just going to I've got 20 minutes, so it's going to be quite quick, but I'm going to run through who we are and what we do, what floodplain meadows are, why we think they're so important, and then a bit about how to manage them and how they're a little bit different from other types of species-rich grassland. And as Marion said, we're running a project in Wales at the moment, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end if I've got time. But if we don't get around to any questions at the end, please feel free to get in touch with us, because we're quite new to Wales, and we're really keen to get to know people who are kind of have interest in floodplain meadows or are working in the floodplain, so don't be shy. So we are a partnership that was set up in 2006 by a group of academics at the Open University studying floodplain meadows. We were a collaboration with some government agencies and NGOs, and you can see some of them and our funders on the right-hand side there. But we're in quite a unique position because our sitting within the OE means we can take that research that we do out to people who need it on the ground, so farmers and conservation organisations, but also government agencies. And that goes both ways as well. So we engage with people working in the floodplain and government agencies, etc., and we can kind of target our research on what they need as well. So I think that's quite a useful place to be. So what we do research. So over a long time we've looked into the eco-hydrology and plant communities of floodplain meadows. They're quite special. Techniques for their management, how to restore them and look after them, and more recently into soil carbon storage, which is quite topical at the moment, I'm sure you know. We do survey work as well, so that includes long-term monitoring of key sites to help us understand them and monitor change, looking at sites ahead of restorations, so sort of having a look at where there might be any barriers to restoration and giving advice that way, and then monitoring success afterwards. And we've also done some large-scale rapid assessment of grasslands across catchments to feed into landscape-scale recovery projects. We just finished one on the Windrush, where myself and 2 others surveyed about 900 hectares this summer, which was fun. And then those 2 things feed into advice that we provide. So we provide evidence-based best practice for conserving and restoring floodplain meadows to anyone who needs it, really. And that can be through in-person site visits. We maintain a website that's full of information. We've got a technical handbook that's free to download, webinars like this one, and sometimes in-person workshops as well. And we do outreach as well to kind of raise the profile of floodplain meadows, and that can be art and community projects with local meadows groups or other community groups. And we run a conference every few years as well, where we get kind of people together to share experiences and sort of share our research with them. And then finally, we do advocacy and policy work as well. So we try and advocate for floodplain meadow restoration as a tool for tackling the climate and biodiversity emergencies. Because they deliver a lot of ecosystem services, which I'll go into a bit later. And our work's fed into policy of statutory environmental bodies and government as well. So the picture there is the team at the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Nature in 2022. And we've recently been part of an expert working group on grasslands that's fed into the design of the new environmental land management scheme in England. So I'll get a touch on that at the end if I get time. But that's gone rather well. Excuse me. So just briefly, what actually is a floodplain meadow, before I start talking about how brilliant they are. So essentially, we define them as species-rich grasslands in a river floodplain that are cut for hay. They're usually in the lowlands, but there are some quite nice examples fairly high up in the Pennines and the Tyne and Tees Valley, so not exclusively. But crucially, they're an agricultural crop, essentially. And that's produced using traditional hay meadow management. So shutting up the meadow in the spring, an annual hay cut in the summer, and then aftermath grazing until it becomes too wet for the stock. But what makes them different from other species-rich grasslands is the fact that they sit next to the river and they're part of that dynamic river system. So they accommodate floodwater and they take deposited silt when the river floods. And that's got implications for how they're managed and also for some of the ecosystem services they provide, which I'll touch on a bit later. So the result of that traditional management and the flood cycle and the kind of particular soils and hydrology that you get in river catchments is a group of quite rare species-rich plant communities. And the main one that we study is the Great Burnet Meadow Foxtail Meadow Community, which is so that's defined by a high frequency of the 2 species on the slide there. So Great Burnet on the top and Meadow Foxtail on the bottom. You might recognise those. And then a few other species as well, like meadow vetchling, common sorrel, meadow buttercup. So that's your classic floodplain meadow community, but there are a range of different grassland types that you get on floodplains, and they tend to be related to the sort of soil hydrology and nutrients, so they sort of exist on gradients of those things. I haven't got time to go into detail on them. Marianne's told me I'm not, which was very sad for me because I'm a botanist. But if you want to read more about them, there's a lot about them in our technical handbook, which is free to download from our website. So if you're into your botanical stuff, to go and have a look at that. So the Great Burnet Meadow Foxtail grassland, you get it on well-drained alluvial soils, which flood periodically. It can be really, really species rich. So the best examples can be up to 42 species per metre square, which is massive if you know about grasslands. And that obviously supports then a range of invertebrates and other wildlife as well from that diversity of plants. But it's really quite rare now. So we think there's about 1,100 hectares left of it in England and Wales. That's less than the size of Heathrow Airport, just for context. So it's teeny tiny. And as you can see, we've only got a few records in Wales, so kind of mostly along the eastern border there. But it used to be, so at the time of the Domesday Book in the early 1800s, we think they were actually really quite frequent, and they were the dominant land use type across most lowland floodplains, certainly in England. And in the Domesday Book, they were one of the most valuable land use types as well, and that's because of their natural fertility, which I'll get into in a bit. But obviously that's not the case now. So floodplains are much more highly modified now, and the main land uses are intensive agriculture and urban development, which have replaced most of the meadows. I think you've probably will have heard the figure of a 97% decline in species-rich grasslands as a whole since the 1930s, and that includes floodplain meadows. So they've had a really bad time of it. So why should we care about that then? Well, so species-rich floodplain meadows, they're really important. We think they're important not just because they're really rare and really beautiful, but because they provide a range of public goods and ecosystem services, which we think are really key to addressing the climate and biodiversity emergencies. I could talk about how brilliant they are all day and all the things they do, but we've only got 20 minutes, so I'm just going to pick on two of them, which are quite topical and aligned with current challenges. So the first one on top right there, they improve water quality. So we've recorded up to 50 tonnes per hectare of sediment deposited on some floodplain meadows, and on an arable field that would run straight back off into the river, you know, taking the silt with it, causing blockages and all the problems that you get with nutrients that are too high in the catchment. So meadows stop that from happening firstly by catching the sediment by the roughness of the vegetation, and then by absorbing the nutrients that come with the silt into the hay crop. So when you take your hay off the meadow, the nutrients go with it. And our research shows that about 6 kilos per hectare per year of phosphorus can be taken from a meadow in that way. So if you imagine floodplain meadow creation at scale, it could go quite a long way to helping reduce the amount of phosphorus in our river systems, which can't be a bad thing. And then secondly, they store a surprising amount of carbon in their soil. So you hear a lot about how good woodlands are. The grasslands get a bit of a bum deal, really, excuse me, in the discussion. So we've been working on this, and our unpublished research has shown that some species-rich floodplain meadows can contain over 200 tonnes of carbon per hectare in the soil, which is really high. And that's down to their well-structured soils and the diversity of plants they support. So a good soil structure is likely to be really key to how much carbon the soil can store. So some recent research has shown it's to do with the soil pore structure is quite important in stimulating carbon accumulation in the soil itself. And then in a species-rich floodplain meadow, you've got a lot of different plants, and all those different plants have different root structures, and some of them go quite deep, several meters deep. The great bonnet can go to about 2 meters, I think, and that means that diversity of sort of structure and depth means they can occupy space more efficiently in the soil space and deeper down the profile than something like a replanted woodland or a silage lay, say. And then they're particularly important because the soil in a floodplain meadow are continuing to grow. So every time there's a silt deposition, the soil grows up and that can be filled with new carbon. So we quite like to counter the view that grasslands, woodlands store more carbon than grasslands, and like to promote the idea that actually grasslands can be a secure long-term store for carbon that are as good, if not better, than some woodlands. But the key point is that they do that whilst remaining agriculturally productive. So you don't have to take them out of farming to be able to store that carbon. And that's one of the reasons, along with all the other ecosystem services on the slide there, that we think grassland, species-rich grasslands, particularly floodplain meadows, need to be valued more in policy and in agri-environment schemes, and that's kind of where we focus our advocacy work. So we talked a little bit about how important they are. I hope I've convinced you there. So I'm going to talk a bit about the management of floodplain meadows. So there's so few of them left now that they really are quite precious and do need to be conserved. But they need a slightly different approach to management because of their relationship with that flood cycle. But also, and we think this is quite important as well, is for those meadows to survive and for meadow restoration to be able to kind of happen and deliver all those brilliant services at scale. They do need to be a productive part of modern agricultural systems. But we think sort of with the right management, haymaking on a floodplain can do all of that whilst increasing biodiversity and also being part of viable nature-friendly farm businesses as well, which is win-win-win-win-win. So this is a lovely slide by one of our PhD students, Vicky Bowskill, and it shows how, so basically all the biodiversity value that you get in a floodplain meadow has developed because of that annual cycling of nutrients which come via the floodwater and then haymaking which removes them. So the diagram shows how, unlike in other grasslands, that sediment is deposited, that's then taken up by, the nutrients are taken up by the vegetation as it grows, then that's then removed in the hay crop when it's harvested, and then you get a natural replenishment during the next flood, and that's all without the need for artificial fertilizers. And that natural fertility is the reason floodplain meadows are once so valuable, so that high value in the Doomsday Book there. So they can be really productive. We've recorded hay crops of up to 6 tonnes per hectare on some sites, so maybe not as much as you get from an intensively managed grassland, but what you do get is achieved with no inputs. And that dynamism and nutrient inputs also why they need different management from dry grasslands, so the ones kind of up out of the floodplain. So nitrogen and phosphorus, they're important nutrients for plants and livestock, but if they build up too much, they can act as pollutants. And we all, you'll have heard that lots of pollution ends up in our rivers from various sources, so intensive agriculture, sewage outlets, various runoff, and almost every river in the UK is polluted in that way now, which is not a good state of affairs. So while the sediment is the kind of natural source of fertility for a meadow, if you allow the nutrients to build up in the soil to excess, then the kind of tall competitive plant species will take over and that botanical diversity will start to fall over time. So removing the nutrients is really key to kind of manage them. And the time, hang on, sorry, have I jumped a slide? No, I haven't. And the timing of that hay cut is really important as well. And that's because the concentration of nutrients in the soil and in the hay changes as the growing season progresses. So when you cut has a really big influence on both your yield and the level of nutrients that you remove in the hay. So if you have a look at the lovely graph here, you can see that nutrients are taken up rapidly during the early part of the growing season. So all that new growth happening, active phase of growth. And then once the flowers have kind of plants have flowered and set seed, you get a more dormant phase in the hot and dry part of the year, and then in the autumn you get a flush of sort of second flush of growth when the rains come back and the temperatures start to drop. So what that means is that hay yield peaks around the summer solstice. You see that on the graph there, and then I have another graph here which shows that phosphorus accumulation peaks at about the same time. So this is research by Vicky Bowskill, one of our PhD students, and basically what she showed was that the optimal time to make hay to maximise your yield and nutrient removal is about between the 20th and 30th of June in central England. So the upshot of that is that if you sort of consistently cut late in, sort of late July, August, or even in September, which sometimes is advocated from a conservation management perspective, or you're restricted to cutting by agri-environment agreements, that essentially removes less nutrients from a meadow and can contribute to the botanical diversity going down over time. So on a system where you're outside of the floodplain, it's low sort of naturally no nutrients, so you're not getting the sediment deposition from the floods. That might not be so much of a problem, but for a floodplain meadow, it's really important to keep those nutrients in balance, but with a timely hay cut. So cutting once in June is usually sufficient to balance out the sediment inputs for a typical meadow in a year, although obviously that varies depending on local circumstances. But another element of Vicky's research was looking at the effect of taking a second hay crop in September to increase nutrient offtake. And she looked at that from a meadow restoration perspective. So if you have a field that you wanted to restore, but the nutrients were already a bit high, so you needed to take off more than was coming in every year. And also from the perspective of controlling nutrients in a catchment, so sort of nutrient neutrality, which is something that's happening in England at the moment. So normally, common hay meadow management in the UK is to cut once in the summer and then aftermath graze. But the grazing portion of that doesn't really remove any additional nutrients because most of it kind of comes back, out the other end of the animal essentially. So Vicky's results showed that double cutting can actually be a really effective way to reduce soil nutrients to enhance your meadow restoration. So taking a first cut in sort of mid to late June rather than July, that maximises a compensatory regrowth. So plants get cut and go, oh, I need to grow again. It extends nectar resources for pollinators as well, because you get a second lot of flowers, and it allows for a maximum level of nutrient offtake in your kind of double harvest. So the two added together give you much more than just a single cut. There are some practical issues around cutting twice, which any farmer would need to weigh up, like weather conditions in September might not be sufficient for kind of turning and drying hay. You might struggle to get a contractor if you haven't got your own machinery. There may be an additional cost involved, or you might need to bail up for haylage if you don't get quite enough regrowth, which obviously is an extra cost of wrap and transporting a moist crop. And in regenerative systems as well, the autumn grazing space might be a higher priority than a couple of extra bales of hay. And if you do make the hay, then there needs to be use for it as well, either on the farm or to sell. So all those need to be taken into consideration. But it's quite interesting to compare that double cut, I think, particularly from a nutrient management and restoration perspective, because it can kind of speed up dropping the nutrients down if you were looking to reintroduce species. So Vicky also looked at the nutritional content of hay from species-rich floodplain meadows, comparing that June and September cut, because I think there was a bit of an idea that a later cut would be sort of more nutritionally poor. And you can see from the graph there, so the June cut is the green and the September cut is the purple. But you can see that both, the cuts at both times of year, June and September, meets the metabolizable energy, which is the Me in the middle there, and the crude protein, so CP, kind of towards the left. And most of the trace elements requirement for beef cattle, except for copper, cobalt, and selenium. So it's pretty well-rounded nutrition, really. There isn't really much research comparing species-rich grasslands with more intensive systems. There is Plant Life did do a literature review a few years back, and what that showed is that while species-rich grasslands don't have the same levels of energy and protein as agriculturally improved grasslands, so silage lays, that kind of thing, the herbs have got much higher quantities of minerals. So if you use species-rich grasslands within your grazing system, that can reduce the need for things like mineral licks. And there's also some evidence that although you might get more energy and protein out of an agriculturally improved grassland overall, that doesn't necessarily always translate to greater levels of animal growth and produce or health. And there was a couple of studies that they cited where livestock grazing herbal lays put on more weight, produced more milk, and were sort of generally healthier compared with livestock on a more intensive system, on improved pasture. We can't necessarily translate that straight to species-rich grassland, but given that kind of leguminous plants, your clovers and things, have got higher protein than grasses, and herbs generally have more trace elements, it seems sort of fairly likely that a species-rich grassland would give a well-balanced nutrition for most livestock, at least in extensive systems, and that does seem to be borne out by Vicky's research here. So that literature review also looked at the kind of human health benefits, and the available evidence suggested that those beneficial long-chain fatty acids are generally higher in meat and milk from animals that are grazed on species-rich grasslands. And there was a study by the University of Bristol that found that that combination of traditional breeds, diverse pastures, and traditional processing methods can give really high quality produce, a high nutritional value for humans that's quite attractive to consumers. And they looked at kind of consumer panels as well, and they found that livestock grazed on species-rich grassland tended to be voted as smelling and tasting better. So this slide, Andy Rummings is a farmer over in towards Swindon. So he farms on species-rich floodplain meadows on the Thames. He's actually one of our ambassadors. We have a network of ambassadors around the country. And he actually sent off some of his steaks to the Bionutrient Institute at Utah State University last year to find out if his beef was nutritionally superior to supermarket beef. So we're looking for high omega-3 and a low kind of omega-3 to 6 ratio. You can see on the right-hand side there that his beef had the highest amount of omega-3 of the 4 categories and the lowest 3 to 6 ratio. So it's nutritionally superior, essentially. So he's now looking into whether he can make the legal claim that his beef is high in omega-3 to kind of help market it as a premium product. which is which is quite interesting. I'm not sure what their kind of sample size and stuff, but I've just put this on as an example. But I thought it's also worth having his nice logo there as well, because you can see that also kind of the habitat itself can be a selling point for produce. So, you know, similar to sort of salt marsh lamb, you might pay a bit more for. And you can see he's incorporated the great bonnet and the snake's head fritillary into his logo there, which I think is quite sweet. And he also runs really, really cool sneaker making workshops. So he gets his leather tanned, vegetable tanned. So it's kind of all sustainable and done in the UK. And you can go to his farm and spend a day making sneakers, which we did last year, which I thought was absolutely fantastic fun. Which is a little aside there. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown on our Welsh project. So we've mostly worked in England, but we've secured some funding to do a project in Wales, which is running to the end of this year. We've taken a kind of chunk on southeast Wales, a bit of Carmarthenshire and a bit up the Wye as our kind of project area, mostly because we've got existing contacts there and have done little bits of work here and there. So it's a little bit arbitrary, but that's kind of our kind of focus. And we've got 3 objectives. So the first is to increase our knowledge. So at the moment, our inventory's only got 27 hectares of species-rich floodplain meadow in Wales. So we're wondering if there might be sort of any fragments that we don't know about. So if anyone thinks they know of a species-rich meadow in the floodplain, do get in touch. So we're sort of species-rich grassland cut for hay, so not just necessarily with the great bonnet in it. And we've got a small budget to visit some sites in the summer. So if you've got some grassland you think fits that bill and would like us to come and have a look, let me know. I've got a limited amount of days, so first come, first serve, but happy to come and see people. And if anyone's planning on any restoration projects in the floodplain, we'd like to hear about that, and we can provide advice for you as well. So we're also trying to build our network, essentially build connections. So we're running a series of these webinars. We might do some in-person workshops later in the year if there's appetite for it, but we're essentially hoping to build a network of kind of people working in the floodplain, so farmers, community groups, meadows groups, or anyone working in the floodplain, so we could share our research and talk to you as well. Like I said, we're quite new to Wales, so we're just starting to get to know anyone. So if anyone thinks they know anyone that would benefit from talking to us, then yeah, please let me know. I'd really appreciate that. And then the third one is to expand our advocacy work. So that at the moment, we're just starting to dip a toe into the Welsh policy agenda, and beginning with responding to the SFS consultation. Don't want to upset anyone. Again, we could talk for a long time about this, but we've not got much time, so I've just put a couple of our main asks in our response to the consultation on the slide there. We've had some success in England with the development of their environmental land management scheme, which we'll be looking to try and replicate in Wales. So there we initially fed into a consultation like this, which didn't really get us very far. But then we started working with other NGOs and we managed to kind of get a place at the table. And then when DEFRA organised some working groups that were working on the different options for the scheme, we were invited onto the one for low and no input grassland. And then we were able to use our research to make the case for floodplain meadows. And Olivia, our advocacy officer, did a brilliant job. And the result was that in the new Countryside Stewardship Plus scheme, which launches from this year, floodplain meadows are a separate premium option that are separate from other species-rich grasslands, and they're higher paid. And it's got a really good payment rate of £1,070 a hectare, which is brilliant. And we feel that that kind of really reflects their value in terms of ecosystem services. And we're really hoping that that will set a precedent for Wales, and we're going to be pushing for a similar outcome. So we think that the Welsh Government should really take a similar approach by using kind of evidence-led expertise. And we're going to be working with other NGOs to try and get them to work in that way, and hopefully providing them with our data to steer their decision making. So yeah, I think that's me. So that's just our contact details there. I'm sure Marianne will circulate them afterwards. And if you're interested in floodplain meadows, do have a look at our technical handbook, because it's absolutely packed full of information. But yeah, so hopefully I haven't gone over my time.
Lovely. Thank you ever so much, Caroline. It was really, really interesting. And I'm so sorry for asking you to take out some of the more detailed and technical stuff. It is fascinating. It is fascinating, but I was just aware of leaving time for for discussion and questions. I
forgive
can
you.
also thoroughly vouch for that Floodplain Meadows Technical Handbook. It is a really interesting read, and I've just popped the link into the, oh no, I haven't, I've turned off my video. Pop the link into the chat there. It's free to download, and as well as having some lovely pictures, it is really interesting. So I thoroughly recommend it to everybody. I think people are still sort of mulling over and formulating their questions. For those of you who joined while the speakers were talking, please, if you have any questions or comments or observations, do drop them into the Q&A function, and then we can put them to our panelists. I've got a couple just to get us started, for Joe and for you, Caroline. I'll start with Caroline. When you say you're interested in finding out about other floodplain meadows that you might have missed or other patches, how rich does a species-rich grassland have to be before it becomes interesting to you? Like how many, what would, if I'm out walking along, you know, besides the bank of the old way here, and I'm thinking, well, we've got lots of different kinds of grasses, we've got some meadow sweets, some yellow rattles, some docks, obviously, some clovers. Is that getting near, or are you looking for other things?
Well, it depends how you kind of define it. So in our work in England, quite often we assess grassland against the priority habitat criteria, and that's got a set of kind of species abundance criteria. So there's a list of indicator species, so species that indicate nice quality grassland. So it's not necessarily just the number of species, but which ones you've got. So things that will be kind of indicative of lower nutrient status. You know, and generally you want to be kind of avoiding stuff that's got too much kind of dock and thistle and stuff in it. But generally you'd be looking for something where I think the priority habitat criteria asks for something like 30% of wildflowers and sedges to grasses. So you've got that ratio is good. And that's not including things like creeping buttercup and white clover, which are kind of not necessarily completely undesirable, but you don't want too many of them because they kind of indicate problems with drainage and compaction and stuff. So I don't know if we've got an exact kind of figure for you, but it's more of a feel. So is there a lot of wildflowers to grasses? You know, if it's very, very grassy and there's just a few species, and those species are ones, you know, like dock, like Plantago major, which is greater plantain, the kind of things that those kind of ones that you would get in a more nutrient heavy system or higher nutrient system. So you'd be looking for the more delicate wildflowers and to have a good cover of them, sort of a third to grasses. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. So a kind of a rule of thumb of do a rough view, and if you think it's about a third interesting wildflowers, then get in touch with you guys and you'll
but I mean we're happy to talk to anyone that's kind of considering restoration as well, because we can provide advice on that. But yeah, I mean if anyone has got grape in a floodplain field, I'd be very interested to hear, because obviously that aligns with the particularly rare plant community that we study, but we do broaden our kind of scope, so we bring in people who might, you know, want to restore meadows as well, so they don't have to be brilliant.
Thank you very much. And the questions that I had for Joe were, I think you talked quite a lot about the way that you manage to farm and the purposes of the species-rich grassland for nature recovery at the Gwent Wildlife Trust farms. But I think you also do something like this on your home farm as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the species-rich grasslands and the hay meadows fit into your kind of objectives for the home farm, and you know, why do you have them on your home farm, basically?
Well, we at home we first most of the land on the farm was an ex-dairy farm, so it was already sort of pretty. There were tiny little patches, little corners on banks that hadn't really never been sort of improved. And we stopped the dairy farm sort of late 80s, and then we went into beef and sheep. We entered the Tir Gofal scheme, and that sort of really kicked off why we were doing the hay meadows. And we've got about home. It's about 25 acres. And that really sort of got me even more interested in hay meadows and sort of what they can provide. I mean, and obviously with the Tir Gofal there, you know, there was a reasonable payment of hectareage, and where we are, it's a difficult spot to sort of intensively farm. So, you know, it's either very wet through the winter, or it's rocky and dry. So, you know, you sort of just go with what the land wants. And for us, the sort of wildlife and nature recovery is a better option for us at home. And the Tir Gofal payment was good. The Glaswelltir was reasonable, and just, I think I've written it down on my notepad what it was, because it's ended now. Yeah, so an unimproved hay meadow, neutral grass hay cutting was paid at £221.25 per hectare under Glaswelltir. And that for us, you know, adds up. So, you know, 10 hectares, you're getting over £2,000. We'd probably get, you know, originally you start with around about 150 bales, and that kind of dwindles down to about 75 now. But it's generally reasonable sheep pay. The problem is late cutting, and that has been sort of a bone of contention with entering into the Glaswelltir agreements, and that sort of, it's the 16th of July, so you know, you can miss a week, or you can be on a really lovely week beforehand, miss that, and then you get, you know, a monsoon for 2 weeks. Every month that goes by, you need another day for drying for hay, and then all of a sudden you're in end of August, September, and like where we are, it's kind of difficult for contractors to come down. I've got a small baler, but I don't have a round baler or a big square, and it's kind of a big ask for people to bump £100,000 worth of equipment into a kind of a steep rocky bank field. And so most of the time it can be cut into September. One year we cut it in October. So that's sort of it's an issue going forward, and it's something perhaps, well, one of the meetings I went to recently at SFS, they were talking about a bit more flexibility around cutting dates. And that might happen. And listening to Caroline actually talk about that is something that, you know, might be useful going forward, that an earlier cut option. I guess it's difficult to quantify for, you know, if you're saying they're going to set up a scheme, how do you sort of do it with multiple options of cutting dates? I'm not sure.
Well, it would certainly seem to me that a scheme that's supposed to be responding to increasingly unpredictable weather patterns and climate change ought to admit that land managers need to be agile in their decision making.
Because the costs have gone through the roof on baling, and so it's one of the problems we're finding at Gwent Wildlife Trust is the cost of baling. So some of these smaller sites, 5 acres, cut lay, you know, is basically dump value. So you've got to and then you've got to remove them from the field. Nobody wants wrapped one silage. So where does it go? It's got to kind of go somewhere. So that's been a problem, and that's sort of some of those shots I've been trialing at home is sort of using cattle to graze off with electric fences and then take them on and off sort of thing, because the practicalities of machinery cutting, and they're lovely little squares of species rich grassland. So trying to look at other ways of doing it, really.
Do you find the stock have got a sort of preference for the regrowth over the, I can imagine the stuff that you leave would be more fibrous and kind of less palatable as well, so you have to restrict them so they have to eat it?
Yeah, I trialed one of the handy little things on the no fence collars. You can build a heat map, and it shows them where they've been in 24 over the 24 hours over. I think you can line up sort of like 6 weeks, or no, it was, I think I looked at 7 days. They actually spent most of their time on the line between the two. So where the cut line is, that's where they're kind of grazing. So they're going in between the two if you've given them the choice. So I would imagine it's a combination of actually grazing on the nice stuff, probably going to sit on the tussocky stuff, the sort of what you might call rank grassland.
Yeah, I wonder if you get a bit of a thatch as well if they're not taking it off. And
Yeah,
not
we do.
Yeah.
But interestingly, because again, like you said, the meadows have been trying on. It's already in 10 years of restoration, so we've dropped nutrients right down.
Yeah.
So you can still, in the middle of all that tussocky grassland, you can still get good shows of common spotted orchid, burstfoot trefoil, etc. I mean, they're nowhere near as species rich as Penrhyn Farm, triple SIs, or equivalent floodplain meadows. But you know, they provide a really good habitat. So yeah.
And that, speaking there, you kind of sashayed into it earlier as well, Joe, but mentioning the H word. If you're looking at your farm now and thinking, well, okay, maybe species rich grasslands are the way forward, or low input grasslands, and you're selecting, you know, which sites to go for, which bits of the farm will be most appropriate. What things would you be considering when making that choice, you know, from your experience of doing it yourself?
Yeah, I think if there's going to be sort of quantifying again from Welsh Government, you know, if you've got somewhere that is a little drier and rocky, it's probably going to be easier to establish a species-rich hay meadow or species-rich grassland on there, because there's just not going to be as many nutrients in there. So if they're going to kind of quantify it by what's there to get your payment for that to enter, then those sites are probably reasonable sites. I think size as well, it's difficult, you know, to shove in sort of 5 acres down a bumpy track or something like that, because realistically, are you ever going to mow it? You know, are you going to make that commitment to do it? So sometimes actually bigger is better. If it's near a main road, you've got good access, you know, you're going to perhaps sell it on to another farmer down the road that's a bit short on grass for a season, that type of thing. So access and sort of ease of management. And then how much you sort of enter, again, is a bit about how your system is, and sort of, you know, if you're going to enter, like, say, we've got 90 acres, we've got 25 acres of a hay meadow. So, you know, you're sort of entering in a quarter, a third to a quarter sort of in type thing as another consideration, and how much forage you're obviously going to use as well through there. But and how far you want to transport it as well. You can often think a hay meadow, you want to stuff it in the far corner, but actually sometimes that can be not the sort of the best option. So, but it's got to fit within the farm system and the rest of the time, because obviously, you know, we want to use the hay on the farm. We also then want to have it's got to tie in with the aftermath grazing as well, because at some point those sheep that are taken off, or cattle, they've got to go somewhere else. They don't sort of just disappear, and the hay meadow carries on. You've got to think where they're going to go.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. That was useful tips there. We haven't had any questions come in. I'm hoping that's because everybody has spoken with such great eloquence and clarity that nobody has any questions, and not because the technology is playing us foul and there are lots of unanswered questions waiting out there in the ether that we can't see. If that is the case, attendees, I'm dreadfully sorry. We can't see your questions, but I think it's probably that we've just given people lots of food for thought, and they're mulling over. We're about at our time now. We said we'd finish by 8 o'clock. So I'd like to take the opportunity again to thank Joe Ryder at Gwent Wildlife Trust, Caroline O'Rourke and David Gowing from the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. Do take time to capture the web links before you leave the webinar. The chat will disappear once you leave, but I will circulate the slides and contact details afterwards, so you can get in touch if you would like to find out more from any of our panelists. And just a little plug again, really, for the Talk Farm Regen Facebook group, which is where we advertise events like this. We've got farm walks, farm visits coming up as well. So check that out, and you'll keep in the loop with all the things that are going on through that group. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evenings. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.